Are the days of the NFA numbered? Well, it seems like the Second Amendment Foundation is doing everything they can to make sure that is the case. Or are they?
We are the superiorly armed beings.
Hey everybody, Yankee here. As many of you may know, the Second Amendment Foundation has filed a lawsuit, I do believe in Texas, challenging the NFA. And the basis for their lawsuit is that they are saying since the tax has recently been reduced to zero on the tax stamp for NFA items, that it can't be a tax anymore. And the government can't really require you to jump through any hoops or do anything special to get that tax stamp if there's no actual monetary fee for it. And that is, like I say, the entire basis for their lawsuit. And the reason they're doing this is, if you remember not too long ago, we had a chance to remove items from the NFA, effectively neutering the NFA by taking things like suppressors, short barrel rifles, etc. off of it, which would have basically negated it. But because of big money interests, namely the people who make items like suppressors, who stood up and said, oh, if we take these things off the NFA, our $1,200 items worth about $200 now. We can't make the big profits we've been making. So they greased a lot of palms in the gun rights groups and in Congress, mostly in the gun rights groups, and, the House, and said, hey, don't take these things off the NFA, keep the NFA, just reduce the tax stamp to zero. That's basically the same thing. We can convince stupid people that that's the same thing, even though they'll have to go through all the same government processes, and they'll just save $200. Whereas if these things were taken off the NFA, they would save way more money than that on each item. But because, like I said, big money won out, the people who make the suppressors spent a lot of money to convince people that just reducing the tax stamp to zero is just as good, which is not the case at all. Well, some gun rights people, after the blowback on this, because a lot of people stood up and said, this is garbage, and we were sold out, and you took money instead of working for our rights, which is one of the biggest problems with a lot of the big gun rights organizations and politics. Well, after people started saying that, they said, oh, no, we got a plan. What we're going to do is, now that it's zero, we're going to say that since there can't be a tax that's zero, we're just going to get it abolished. But there's some problems with that. Let's talk about those today. Let's talk about, is this a great thing? Or is this just more smoke and mirrors, more games from another gun rights group? Now, I've always been a fan of the Second Amendment Foundation. I've done a lot for them in the past. I'm a lifetime member. But with new management, some of them named, something like sauerkraut, if you know who I'm talking about. They're some of the biggest profiteers in the gun community. They always have been a leech on the Second Amendment community, in my opinion. And I never support them for anything. And now that they're in charge at the Second Amendment Foundation, it seems like the Second Amendment Foundation is doing just the same stuff every other group does. Because this is mostly garbage. I've actually spoken to 3 different attorneys now, 2 of which are tax attorneys. And I just said, hey, how about this notion that a tax can't be zero? If the tax is zero, the government can't regulate anything if they're not actually charging you a monetary fee. And they basically laughed at that. Because there's all kinds of circumstances in the law where you don't actually owe a monetary fee, but you're still required to go through the process. With personal income taxes, capital gains, transfers of property, all kinds of things. They said there's literally dozens of cases where tax doesn't have to be monetary. In fact, throughout U.S. history, there are other types of taxes that are not monetary, in-kind taxes, all kinds of things. So they said the whole idea that if a tax is zero, but the law is still there that requires the process of registration, that is somehow void is ridiculous and doesn't really hold any legal water. In fact, all 3 of them saw no merit whatsoever to it. And these people aren't involved in the cases or making money off the cases, so I have no reason to believe they'd lie to me. 2 of them are longtime friends. So it seems like the case itself probably has very little merit. And after I went and did some research based on what these guys said, I found all kinds of cases where taxes can be zero, but the government can still require you to jump through hoops. It's the same thing with your income taxes. Even if you don't owe any taxes, if you make a minimum amount of money, you still have to go through the process. Your bill at the end is zero, but you still had to go through the process simply because they said you had to, even if they're not charging you any money. and that's based on a tax law. So there's all kinds of cases where zero can be the fee, but the process is still in place legally. So it doesn't seem like this case has a lot of merit, which is probably why they filed it in Texas, because they know the courts there will let it go as far as it can before they get it thrown out. Whereas in most states, it would just be thrown out right away. And the longer the case is running, the more money they can make, the more fundraising they can do off of it. Because that seems to be what this is. It's just a fundraising scheme. Because even the one attorney who said, well, you might get some actual result from this lawsuit if you sue the government and you say the tax can't be zero for this tax law to exist, well, then the government would have no choice but to go and raise the amount of the tax. Even if they just made it $1, that's all they'd have to do to become, compliant with the law, if there was such a law, which there really isn't. So even if they won the suit, the most likely result would not be a law that was passed by Congress being removed. It would be the tax stamp price would have to go back up, which is very likely to happen anyway if Democrats take back over. If they get all three branches of government ever again, they've already talked about how they want to raise it from the $200 it was to thousands of dollars. So look for that coming in the future. And once again, you have the big money interests in the gun community and the gun groups to thank for that. So that would be the most likely result. So you think to yourself, well, why would they file this lawsuit then? If they're not actually going to win it, well, it only cost about $100 to file a lawsuit. The NRA was notorious for that. Like, look, we filed this lawsuit. Now pay our millions of dollars of expenses, even though it cost them about $100 for the filing fee. I think here it's $80. I can go down and file a suit right now if I wanted to, and then tell you all, hey, pay my expenses. But, I ain't got time for that. So, and plus, I don't think most of my viewers would fall for that. I would hope not. But like I said, that seems to be what's going on with the Second Amendment Foundation under their current leadership. And if you don't believe me, just look at the email they sent out talking about it. It's not a, hey, we're putting your membership money to use, or, hey, you lifetime members that paid us a big fee up front, we're putting that money to use. We're actually working, and sometimes we're doing it pro bono just to get this work done, to get results. That's not what they're doing. They actually sent in the email, hey, since you're not paying your $200 tax stamp, give it to us. So they're not even asking for $10, $20, $25, even $100. They're asking for $200 for a lawsuit that really didn't cost them anything. Since they have lawyers on the board, not going to cost them any legal fees, really. I mean, they're already making a salary for being on the board. Are they going to charge legal fees on top of that? If they are, that's kind of like double dipping. That don't seem all that legal to me. But, what do I know? These guys are the big attorneys. I've dealt with one of them. One of them sent me a cease and desist email one time because I asked them what they're doing with the money from one of their organizations. They didn't want to talk about that. And this seems to be like another case of that, where they're just trying to get money because they basically filed a cheap lawsuit in a state where they think it'll go as far as it can possibly go before it gets thrown out. And now they're fundraising, and they're not asking for little bits of money. They're asking for big amounts of money. Well, what about our monthly dues? Why is that not paying the expense for this? What about your salaries? Why aren't your salaries paying for you to litigate this case? Just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Now, if someone can explain it to me in a way that makes better sense, I'll listen. But right now, it looks suspicious. Just like how I recently had to say, it seems suspicious when the Second Amendment Foundation dropped a lawsuit against the state of Washington in exchange for not being investigated. That looks suspicious. And you can say, well, it was the state was stalling and they were just wasting their time. Waste their time. It's not a waste of time if you're actually doing something. And I've never heard in lawsuits where they're like, well, I tried to sue the people that wronged me, but they didn't cooperate. You force them to cooperate. You do whatever you got to do. Didn't seem like an excuse to me. So found that very suspect. Still do. And this is just another case that I find very suspect. Now, like I said, I'm always open to people coming telling me different. I do live chats every night at 6 p.m. Wouldn't be hard for any of these people that are involved to come in and talk in my live chat and give their side of it and let you all see which one seems to make more sense, theirs or mine. And like I say, my side of the story is just my opinion based on my research and my experience with these gun groups. Remember, I was one of the people calling for the downfall of the NFA. I was sounding the trumpets on their malfeasance long before anybody else would, because they were all taking the money. I don't take the money. So I use my experience and what little bit of brains I have to go to people that are smarter than me and try to figure these things out when they don't make sense. And in this case, it just doesn't make sense. And it was such a blatant cash grab to ask for $200 from each individual on the hopes that, the NFA will go away. Well, we could have had the NFA go away already if they were willing to allow that to happen. But they already showed us that they would rather keep the NFA, keep getting big donations from these manufacturing companies that make huge profits off these items, and just give lip service to the people who actually want to buy the items. Because if they'd have gotten them off the NFA, I guarantee you'd be seeing suppressors for $200, $300 right now. You'd probably see imports for $150. And you wouldn't go through any hoops to get them. But no, instead they try to convince you that, just reducing it to zero, that's part of our plan overall to get rid of the NFA, when they had an opportunity to get rid of the NFA and they chose not to because it's more profitable to keep it. What would make anyone think they've changed their opinion since then? Nothing. So like I said, this just seems like a huge money grab as far as I'm concerned. It's a perfect example of why these gun groups are not only not useful, they're detrimental. For years, the NRA had to maintain a battle. They had to keep our rights on the line to keep that money coming in. And now just other organizations have stepped up and they're doing the same thing. They're basically saying, hey, we're your protectors and you have to pay us because you're constantly under threat. And if the threat ever goes away, why would you pay us? So we're going to make sure that threat stays. But during the time we're doing that, we have to actually look like we're doing something. So we're going to file lawsuits with very limited scope. That was one of the things one of the attorneys I talked to said, well, this lawsuit has a very limited scope. It has a very narrow chance of ever actually achieving anything because of the way they worded it themselves. And that has to be intentional. These are professionals, right? So they have to appear like they're doing something without actually risking pissing off the big money interests. They can't lose the numbers of people who support them. So they have to make them think we're fighting for you, but they can't lose the money of the gun manufacturing industry, so they can't actually make any change. And that's what this looks like. It looks like it's smoke and mirrors. It is just a circus exhibit. It is theater so that the money keeps coming in, and it's a big cash grab to profit off of it.
Spectatus fructus dies et non